Ever called Mr. James Bond?
Mr. James Bond?
Mr. James Bond. Miss James Bond.
Well, I probably will because that in that picture was coming out.
That's, yes, Casino Royale.
Yes.
But actually, this is what I thought might start you off on the right track, and I guess it did, because it's opening in April here in New York, Casino Royale.
Yes.
Which is the new James Bond epic.
Well, one of two, John. There were two James Bond pictures coming out.
What's the other one?
Well, there's Casino Royale and the other one.
The other one.
Casino Royale has many James Bonds.
Yeah, the point is
and
made.
of course, the old James Bond is coming out, I think. I don't know when.
June.
In June, thank you.
In my day, spying was an alternative to war, and the spy was a member of a select and immaculate priesthood.
Things are bad, very bad.
This place brings back a few memories.
Sir James Bond is back with his morals, his vows, and his celibate image. We must destroy that image.
Hello, Taylor.
James Bond. What are your qualifications? Dawdlery.
It's depressing that the word secret agent becomes synonymous with sex maniac.
The target has just entered Scotland.
Many people here who loathe and despise you.
It is a training center for what are commonly referred to as spies.
2 cups of this and you're stoned out of your mind. Mr. Bond. Miss Mr. Bond.
You amuse me, Mr. Bond.
And now, if you're ready, Mr. Le Chiffre, I would like to play Bacharach.
You should take a moment and check the papers in your desk at home. You could possibly be the proud owner of the rights to James Bond. Or at least a percentage of them. It seems like the rights to the 007 character, his stories and books and movies, the profits he's accumulated through the years, they've all been sliced up in such a confused way that it's become hard to keep track of who really owns what. So, who knows? Maybe one of us average Bond fans could be sitting on a potential gold mine. Let me say up front, this is by no means a definitive recounting of the history of Casino Royale. I'm just trying to piece together the events as best I've learned them. I clearly wasn't there for any of this, so don't take my word for any of what follows. I could be completely wrong. This labyrinth of ownership regarding 007 can mainly be traced back to Casino Royale and Thunderball. The ownership of Thunderball resulted in a big ruckus that eventually settled into a partnership between EON producers Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli and Kevin McClory to team up to make the 1965 film. But for decades afterwards, the rights to the story were still up in the air. The whole thing is so convoluted, I still don't fully understand it. Maybe this book can clear that mess up for me. I still have to get around to reading it. As for Casino Royale, it's a bit more straightforward, but still resulted in a very rocky road. Now, Fleming had sold the rights to CBS for their 1954 adaptation for the show Climax. After having finished with that and it not really causing much of a sensation, in 1955 Casino Royale then made its way into the hands of actor-director Gregory Randolph, who had definite intentions to make Casino Royale into a film. By January 1956, the New York Times announced that Randolph had set up a production company and planned to film Casino Royale that summer, with 20th Century Fox planning to release it. That particular article also mentions that Ian Fleming had written a film adaptation to the novel, which wasn't going to be used. The idea that Fleming actually wrote a film screenplay for Casino Royale is very intriguing. However, if this article is 100% accurate, that screenplay has never been found. There was evidently a bump in the road with Radoff's casino project, since, well, it never got made, although he apparently didn't give up on the project. Radoff died in 1960, still owning the rights to Casino Royale. And this is where things get even more fascinating. Radoff's widow sold the casino rights to Charles K. Feldman, who'd been a close friend to Radoff. Feldman was this playboy producer and super agent in Hollywood at the time. Supposedly he threw a lot of great parties. Owning the rights to Casino Royale started to have a little more cachet when in March 1961, Life magazine listed President John F. Kennedy's 10 favorite books. And as Bond fans know, From Russia with Love was on that list. I don't think anyone would care much about this today. I don't see us Americans being too interested in what our president is reading. At least I wouldn't be. But in 1961, everyone loved Kennedy. All that mystique of Camelot, how Jackie was so hot, it all made everyone perk up their ears at the details as to what Kennedy would be reading before he turned off the lights laying next to Jackie, or whoever it might have been that night. Suddenly, Bond novels became bestsellers in the U.S. 3 months later, one of Feldman's former employees at Famous Artists, Cubby Broccoli, formed EON Productions with Canadian producer Harry Saltzman, after they had bought the rights to Fleming's 007 novels. All of them except Casino Royale. Well, you have to know what happened next.
I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Dr. No, starring Sean Connery, premiered. It was the start of movie audiences' love affair with 007, and was the beginning of one of the most successful film franchises in cinema history. The films would become international blockbusters, and made James Bond one of the most popular and profitable fictional characters ever. It also created an army of films that attempted to be part of it. The 60s spy craze began, and created plenty of films that tried to cash in on Bond's popularity. As Feldman looked on, he must have had a big smile on his face. He had an easy, big, juicy foot in the door to get into all this. He owned Bond's first adventure, Casino Royale. Initially, Feldman considered making a straight, serious Bond film. At one point, he even hoped it would star Sean Connery and Shirley MacLaine. He approached Connery early on about starring as Bond in his film. By that point, though, Connery had one foot out the door wanting to play Bond anymore, and when he was asked by Feldman, he simply responded, "Only for $1 million. That salary demand was just too much for Feldman to meet at the time. There were talks between EON Films and Feldman to partner up and make Casino Royale an official Bond film. But that didn't last long. Supposedly the breaking point was when Feldman demanded that he receive 75% of the box office profits, and the remaining 25% would go to Broccoli, Saltzman, and United Artists. Surprisingly, they weren't too thrilled with that deal. Feldman eventually reconsidered making it a serious story for whatever reasons. Maybe he just didn't like his odds of being able to compete with the big-budgeted, thrilling EON films. Or as Val Guest, one of the directors, recounted years later.
He gave me 4 scripts to read, and I was handed all this, and I said to Charlie Feldman, well, where's the book? Let me read the book, too, because I hadn't read it. And he said, we can't use the book because they've used sequences in every other Bond film. He said, the only thing we've got left is the title and the casino. So we had to start from scratch.
I'm not so sure exactly what he means by that. I don't see why they couldn't just film the book they owned. But maybe there was some legal thing going on, or they just thought it was better to go in a different direction or something. Either way, Casino Royale would become a comedy, spoofing the Bond films. Columbia Pictures agreed to a budget of $6 million. A pretty large budget in 1966. But it was nothing as to what the film eventually ended up costing. After the film was finally finished, having endured countless production problems and a budget that just skyrocketed, Feldman saw Connery at a Hollywood party and supposedly told him it would have been cheaper and easier if he had just paid him that $1 million in the beginning. Feldman went about assembling a cast. His first casting coup was Peter Sellers, who, thanks to his performances in Dr. Strangelove and the Pink Panther movies, was extremely popular at the time. Sellers was paid $1 million, along with a white Rolls-Royce to star. I don't really understand why Feldman decided to pay Sellers $1 million and not Connery. Maybe this is inaccurate, but that's what I've read Sellers' original salary agreement was. If it's true, I don't get it. I guess Feldman eventually decided the high price would be worth the investment of a big-name star. Or maybe he just had more money from Columbia to play with at this point. If I was him, I would have gone back to Connery, called his $1 million bluff, and gotten him to the set right away. David Niven, who was once Fleming's ideal actor to play 007, would finally get to play James Bond. Woody Allen, Orson Welles, Ursula Andress, Deborah Kerr, Barbara Bouchet, Jacqueline Bisset, John Huston directing 1/5 of the film. Now really, there are some pretty funny and talented people involved in this. Casino Royale had some real potential to be the ultimate James Bond spoof film. Stellar cast, huge budget, released at the height of the James Bond craze. What could go wrong? Mayhem. Casino Royale for me is one of those films where the behind-the-scenes drama ends up much more interesting and entertaining than the actual film itself. I've heard countless stories about the production, some completely crazy. Like I said, I don't know if all of them are true, but I'll share with what I've heard just because I think they're so friggin' funny, and hearing this stuff, I'm amazed that the film even managed to get finished. All these stories might also explain how the budget doubled from $6 million to $12, making it one of the most expensive films ever at that point in cinema history. For comparison, You Only Live Twice, which was released the same year, cost only $9.5 million. Characters randomly disappear and reappear. There's a bunch of psychedelic montages, and the film tries to pile on more and more zaniness in the attempt of being a big laughing party. It is one trippy movie in the same vein as the popular groovy films during this period. As an example of that, Casino Royale is worth a watch, but as a spoof of James Bond films, not so much. It's not a spoof or parody movie as how we would define it today. It doesn't spend an awful lot of time doing gags on the Bond formula that audiences were at that point very familiar with. The film was directed by 5 separate directors, each filming their own segments. Unfortunately, the script didn't take into very basic considerations, such as a general story thread that would weave each segment seamlessly into one another. Directors were said to be filming alone, with no idea what was going on with the rest of the production. So I'm not even going to get into trying to explain the story, since it's such a stream of consciousness kind of movie that it matters very little to try to follow it anyway. If the filmmakers didn't bother with having a cohesive story to tell, what luck do I have deciphering one out of this? But the general idea is that David Niven is the retired, real James Bond 007, but MI5 now assigns that name and number to another agent in order to keep the legend alive and his enemies fearful that he's still on the job. Niven eventually comes back to the service to battle Smersh, and in a strategic move decides to assign every agent the name James Bond 007, in order to confuse the enemy. The film consists of a patchwork of these agent adventures, culminating in a madcap finale at Casino Royale. Ironically, the one I find to be the most silently awkward and head-shaking is the beginning of the film, with Niven traveling to Scotland to visit the widow of M. M's been killed in a bomb attack by his own orders. I don't know, he kind of ordered his men to Who cares? M was played by John Huston, though. M's widow and daughters are smirch replacements who try to discredit Bond's celibate image. It's a whole lot of strangeness. Deborah Kerr's casting kind of came about by accident. She dropped by the set to visit Huston, was asked to play a guest part, and that ballooned to 2 months of work. From her work on Casino Royale, she bought a new swimming pool, which she would later dub the Charles K. Feldman Memorial Swimming Pool. That joke's funnier than anything she does in the movie. I just don't get it. Niven does the bewildered outsider role as he stays in this nutty castle. Deborah Kerr, who actually looks pretty good, tries to get him in the sack, but this James Bond refuses all the opportunities he has with this family of chicks. He ends up winning some kind of Scottish strongman competition or something. The whole sequence just drags and never results in any funny. I remember when I first watched this, thinking, wow, if this is the first 30 minutes, this is going to be one long movie. The opening Scotland part was directed by John Huston. Apparently, he agreed to do it only if he was allowed complete control of the writing and the filming of his segment. Plus, he supposedly took the gig to pay off a gambling debt. Huston insisted on shooting the Scottish grouse hunting scenes in Ireland, where there were no grouse. Supposedly, the only reason Huston was so keen to go to Ireland was because he wanted to go fox hunting. Ignoring budget constraints, Huston stayed there filming for months instead of weeks, until one day he just stopped shooting, decided to leave, and Val Guest was informed he had to finish what Huston started. I don't think Huston's heart was really in this film. I guess he only took the gig for the money and the fox hunting. The grouse had to be edited into the final film. After surviving Smersh's attempts on his life, Niven heads back to headquarters. Now we get into familiar Bond territory, and we get our best semblance of an overall story.
From now on, all remaining agents and trainees will be known as James Bond 007, including the girls.
Won't that be rather confusing, sir?
Exactly. The enemy won't know which way to turn. You are now James Bond.
Congratulations, 007.
And you, 007, sir.
Good hunting, 007.
This wacky idea is supposed to be the big hook of the film, I guess. It was used as the tagline on the posters and the trailers and everything.
Casino Royale is too much for one James Bond.
You gotta understand, bigger is better, and much, much funnier. Quantity over quality, right? An agent is trained to resist the temptations of beautiful women. This gag doesn't have any payoff down the road, by the way. But we do get to see this guy kiss a lot of hot women. These 60s sexy birds they're really something. And see, they were already spoofing Ursula Andress' white bikini even back then. Surprisingly, this is a much more subtle reference than the one Halle Berry did years later. A vast number of writers worked on the screenplay, and it was constantly being rewritten. Woody Allen was holed up in a lush London hotel waiting for his scenes to be shot. He had to wait there 6 months. He made the most of his time there, though. He wrote a Broadway play and his own screenplay. By the time he got to shooting his scenes, he was well into overtime pay. He inevitably was asked to help with rewrites, like everyone else probably. But he still felt burnt about the alterations Feldman had done to his screenplay of What's New Pussycat. So Allen just focused rewriting his own scenes to try to improve them. His lines are actually the funniest in the movie.
You realize this means an angry letter to the Times.
He made it absolutely clear to Feldman that he didn't want his name under any kind of screenplay or writing credit for the film.
Are you in the picture Casino Royale too?
Yes, I didn't write it right there. I'm just appearing
You're just playing in it.
He's loafing in this one.
Are you the new James Bond?
I am Bondian in general, yes.
Bondian.
Now we get the big guns of the film, Ursula Andress and Peter Sellers. These two would be the main draw to watch this movie. Peter Sellers in a Bond spoof film, and co-starring alongside the most famous Bond girl ever. I'm so there. This is the beginning of a portion of the film that actually kind of resembles Fleming's Casino Royale novel. Kind of. Andress plays Vesper Lynn, an ex-agent who is to recruit expert Bacharach player Evelyn Tremble to become the new James Bond, and win a game against the evil Le Chiffre. The most notorious stories that revolve around Casino Royale is with Peter Sellers. During filming, Sellers was being extremely difficult. Supposedly, he was under the impression that Casino Royale would not be a comedy, but in fact, he would be playing a serious version of James Bond. Or at least, that's what he wanted to do in it. I always found this story fascinating. I mean, if I was an actor and I signed up for a movie, I would think I would want it made clear if it was going to be a drama or a comedy. So I suspect Sellers had to know they hired him to be funny. But I guess he just didn't care. How nuts is that? These conflicting viewpoints between Sellers and the filmmakers certainly fit in with all the other nutty stories behind this movie. From the stories I've heard, by this point in his career, Sellers wanted to be taken more seriously, and wanted to prove he could do more than just get laughs, and that he could potentially be a suave, romantic leading man. So he just decided, well, you guys might be making a comedy, but I'm not.
Cut! Cameras cut! First positions, everyone!
How are we doing, Pete? Feel free to, improvise. We're doing a spoof here, remember?
I'm playing it straight, as myself, like Cary Grant.
Sellers does seem to be playing it straight. Most of the time. His love scene with Andress starts as a sensual exercise in romance, but gradually it gets into more zaniness. Sellers begins a series of random impressions and dress-up. This was supposedly prompted by Joseph McGrath, who somehow convinced Sellers to include a little bit of comedy in here. I don't really think it's that funny, though. And what kind of performance did Sellers think he was giving? I used to think his intention was to play Tremble as this goofball, and then when the metamorphosis hits and he becomes James Bond, he would play it straight. But that doesn't really jive with some stuff down the road.
But you know, we mustn't forget that the beggar who is sitting in the marketplace is completely deaf in so much as far as listening to the song that is coming from the mockingbird is concerned.
I'm sorry, Mr. Bond, I don't get the connection.
So, there just doesn't look to be any reasoning to his performance at all. I guess he played it his way, and when the filmmakers got lucky with him on a good day, he would throw in some funny bits. This could make a pretty good premise for a comedy, actually. The most famous comedic actor ever gets hired for an extravagant, expensive comedy, but decides he's going to play it as a drama and use it to turn his screen persona around, much to the confusion of the filmmakers. Now that would have been funnier to watch than this Casino Royale. Andress does what she does really well. She looks hot, and she brings her famous Bond connection to the film. Yep, that sums her up. Supposedly a memo by Feldman declared, "No background dogs in my picture. Get only real beauties." Hundreds of young sexy models and actresses auditioned for the film. Fortunately, Casino Royale placed the headquarters of Smersh under the Playboy Club in London. Hugh Hefner apparently appreciated this shout-out, and loaned the film truckloads of his playmates to appear in various roles. The film does slow down long enough to poke fun at the famous Q scenes. This scene is probably the closest to how I originally would have envisioned a Bond spoof film in 1967 would have been.
I shouldn't use that pen, so the moment the nib touches the paper, it releases a stream of poisonous gas into the writer's eye.
Heavens, what do they think of next? I can go near that. I suppose it'd come in quite useful if you ever wanted to send anyone a poison pen
letter, yes. All our new men say that.
It's kind of funny how this gag made its way into the official Bond series years later.
Wonderful for poison pen letters.
Pay attention, 007.
What would a big, expensive, outlandish, groovy film be without a scene with an elephant? Well, it was planned. Ursula Andress was meant to be riding an elephant in some kind of crazy circus scene. However, Sellers put a stop to it. Sellers was extremely superstitious, and thanks to a dream he had of his mother telling him not to do the scene because it was too dangerous, it was scrapped, and the set was just taken down. Andress was disappointed at losing the elephant scene. She enjoyed her Elephant Boy outfit so much, she was allowed to wear the extravagant costume while walking around her control room, even if it doesn't make much sense.
What a charming outfit that is. Do you often wear that in the office?
If I wore it in the street, people might stare.
It's funny how things just happened in this film. Sellers at the time was married to future Bond girl Burt Bacharach. Their marriage was unstable by this point, and Sellers would consistently be chasing after Jacqueline trying to save it, even when he was scheduled for filming. Fruitless attempts to get him to the set would be made by helpless production assistants. So throughout the production he was almost always late, or just didn't arrive at all. At one point he disappeared for 3 weeks, while 2,000 extras stood around and waited. The film then shifts into a story of Niven's Bond reuniting with his daughter from a long-ago tryst with Mata Hari. He treks to meet Mata, played by Joanna Pettet, and she looks good. It's sequences like this that really show off some of the money the film had to play with, too. The set design here starts to rival the huge sets in the official series. It's a pretty extravagant dance number for such a silly movie. Then we're dropped into one of the most surreal, dreamlike sequences of Mata heading off to Berlin and infiltrating a school that's a cover for Smersh. Well, I don't know what she's supposed to be doing here. Get some microfilm or something, I think. For all the strangeness watching this sequence in this film, I always thought it looked pretty cool. The sets are obviously inspired by the old great German expressionist films. You got tilted angles and strong shadows. Some of it looks like an Escher painting. How did the filmmakers ever dream that this would fit into a Bond spoof? I don't understand how they came up with putting this into a movie that was spoofing James Bond. I don't get it. I don't see the connection to James Bond's world with this. They must have been smoking some pretty heavy stuff.
The 5 of you are invited, more accurately challenged, to compete in my latest creation, the ultimate game, which I call the Great All-Nighter.
Typically with these big zany movies where there's a huge cast and all these different characters running around that you have to follow, it helps to have one clear-cut story. Sort of like one giant story umbrella where you have all the characters playing underneath it. All the characters have the same goal.
Each of these lists is identical. It contains the clues for 100 items. Each item has its own point value. The winner of the event will be the team or the person who collects the most points. Acquire the items any way you choose, except by purchase, and store them in the areas designated on your list. Back at 5 o'clock. That's it.
What the hell's going on here?
Oh, it's a scavenger hunt.
They have the same objective.
Now, I suggest that we quietly get into our cars, and then when we get down there, we dig up the money, providing that there is some money there.
There's only one way to figure it, and that is every man for himself.
Now, where have I always told you that the Smiler hid the dough?
Or they're all in the same situation.
It's a full-scale invasion.
Jets!
What are you guys shooting at? I don't know! Whatever they're shooting at!
They blew up Congress!
There's one clear target everyone is aiming for.
When you leave, you're going to punch out here at this time clock. 3,000 miles roughly away from here is another time clock just like that at the Portofino Inn. The difference between the two times is your time across the country.
the hell is going on here? Everybody's driving like maniacs.
And they're generally all in the same predicament.
The fact is, we have been invaded by a mutant species of the African killer bee.
You set it up, and we're off and running. Then the film can just go off into different directions with all these characters, and we're never left confused as to what they're trying to accomplish or overcome.
But I never thought I'd see the final face-off in my lifetime. And I never dreamed that it would turn out to be the bees. They've always been our friends.
Here, I don't know what's going on half the time or how it relates to the rest of the story. The only thing that's made clear is that there are a lot of James Bonds running around. This movie is just too much for one James Bond. Yeah, that's not much of a story. By the way, I love how in the trailer it says suggested by the Ian Fleming novel. Man, poor Fleming must have been spinning in his grave. Feldman should have just sold the rights to Cubby Broccoli. He's not doing anything with the story he owns anyway. This idea of multiple James Bonds running around isn't necessarily a bad idea. There are all sorts of things you could do. Different takes on 007, various spoofs of the films, the characters, and cliches. But it really doesn't do any of that. There are a few broad targets, but at times it appears to forget about James Bond and the spy craze, and it just gets into completely surreal territory. This was completely goofed up at the writing stage. Looking at this, I would have suggested, okay, so you have 5 different directors. Why you need 5, I don't know, but we'll go with it. So why not make it an anthology film? Each of these 5 segments recount one of these James Bond's silly adventures, and will have no relation to any of the others. You can use Niven as the bridging device. He's the real James Bond, now retired, and M is trying to convince him to come back into the service by telling him all the troubles they're having with all these imposter James Bonds running around and goofing everything up. At least some of the stories might have been hit or miss. Maybe 1 or 2 would have actually been funny, instead of just trying to cram everything into one long, baffling movie.
It was at the end of the film when all these things had got together and they've all been edited by Bill Lenny, my editor, who had done his best. Charlie Feldman said, well, it sort of somehow doesn't make sense. I thought, man, that's an understatement. And he said, it needs a sort of a storyline going through it. Now, this is a hell of a time to think of that when you've just made the film. And I said, yes, it needs a thread going right through all these sequences. And so he said, well, write it. Just like that. So you sit in that room, projection room, and see all these segments through it. I said, I'll only write it if you allow me to use David and Ursula Andress as my link figures, because I knew they were gigglers enough to help me keep my sanity through this. So I wrote them right through as sort of link lines.
Trying to connect all these stories afterwards was pointless. An hour and a half in, Sellers enters Casino Royale to play against Le Chiffre, played by Orson Welles. And keeping with the rest of the film, it's pretty strange and forgettable. Having Welles in this might have seemed like a real coup, but he had started to become a parody of himself by this point. His appearance doesn't add as much as it could have. Apparently his contribution to the film was to want Le Chiffre to do magic tricks. The idea doesn't seem that inspiring, and again, it doesn't result in much funny. Behind the scenes he made much more of an impact on the production. Sellers refused to film scenes with Welles. They supposedly hated each other. I love reading about these big star feuds. As Joe McGrath had said, this was my first film in Panavision, the letterbox-shaped screen. You could hold 100 yards of the set in the lens. We had 700 extras for the gaming sequences, but we had no way of bringing our 2 stars together in the same shot. So they shot their stuff separately and it was edited together. Even when I was little seeing this flick, not knowing anything about the behind-the-scenes drama, I always wondered why they never filmed these 2 in the same shot. They managed to get one or two, but it's pretty obvious when you see it. It's like that Sinatra cameo in Cannonball Run 2. Joseph McGrath was a personal friend of Sellers, who Sellers had initially insisted be hired for the film. They ended up getting into a fistfight one day on the set. I would love to know what that was about. Sellers demanded Feldman fire McGrath, and soon after, Sellers had a fallout with Feldman too. Finally, things got too crazy for McGrath. He completed his contractual agreement and left the unfinished film. Sellers eventually came back to film other scenes, and he kept calling McGrath, pleading with him to return to the film. At one point, Sellers supposedly promised McGrath that if he returned, Feldman would give him a Rolls Royce. He gave me one. Feldman did end up offering McGrath a Rolls if he returned, but apparently it just wasn't worth the headache to him. Sellers' frequent disappearances finally ground the production to a halt, and finally Feldman terminated his contract and fired him. See, isn't this stuff more interesting than me talking about the actual movie? Joseph McGrath had enough sense to jump off this out-of-control train, but now he needed to be replaced. Cue director Robert Parrish. When he arrived, he saw this huge, empty, white circular set, and had no idea what it was for. There was nothing in the script to indicate what it was for. I didn't know what to do with it, and for a few days I just hoped it would go away. But then Peter came up with his dream sequence, and those damn pipers. So this set ended up being used for the parade of Scottish Highlanders. It's here where Peter O'Toole popped in for a quick cameo, and was given a case of champagne by Feldman for his contribution. Robert Parrish lasted 2 weeks on the film before he split. With Sellers now gone, his James Bond clumsily leaves the film. Apparently they were able to shoot some of Bond's torture at the hands of Lashif before Sellers had split, and they just slapped it together as best they could. It's pretty horrible, and it gets even stupider when Ursula Andress just shoots Sellers. That was their solution. I guess the filmmakers were just backed into a corner and had to be content with this end to his story. This is why I wish they just had a documentary crew on this set when all this stuff was going down.
Well, we meet again. I had a feeling you wouldn't give up so easily.
Bloody Christ, Peter, when are you coming back to the set?
Wouldn't you like to know?
Seeing as we're 3 weeks behind schedule, yeah, I would.
I would have loved to see the discussions about how they were trying to save this film. Now in somewhat of a pickle with losing his lead star, Feldman began rewrites on the script, drastically altering the storyline, and construction began building new sets at Pinewood and Elstree Studios. In Variety on March 2nd, 1966, Feldman was quoted as saying, "Our concept for this film includes not only multiple stars, but also multiple directors." I have to say one thing about Feldman. He really tried his best at keeping a positive attitude in the public about all this. He was really trying to sell this film. It's kind of hard to believe, but some scenes actually didn't make the final cut of this film. I don't know why, considering the film never seems to care about any kind of logic or pacing or its length. They might as well have just crammed every piece of footage that was shot into this. After a spaceship lands and kidnaps Mata, Niven wraps things up by confronting his nephew, Jimmy Bond. Woody Allen is definitely my favorite James Bond in this flick. He does his patented neurotic character. He actually has some pretty good lines, and he comes off funnier than anyone else. Oh, and Dahlia Lavi, she looks great naked under those metal clamps.
Why don't you unlock me?
Yes, I will. I'll unlock you immediately, and we'll run amok.
Thank you.
If you're too tired, we'll walk amok.
Hey, we haven't heard anything about Jacqueline Bisset's experience on Casino Royale. She was a young and up-and-coming actress, landed a role in a big Hollywood film. She must have been happy to be there. In 2001, she took a moment to reflect on her career and talked about her worst ever leading man. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was horrible to work with. My first big role was Casino Royale, and I was supposed to enter the bathroom in a nightgown with a big bottle of champagne suggestively cradled in my arms, trying to seduce James Bond. As a sick joke, Sellers turned and fired a gun directly into my face. There was a blank in the gun, and the burning gunpowder and shreds of the blank hit me directly in the face. First I thought I had actually been shot, and when I realized it had been a blank, I thought I had been blinded. My face looked like a shower spout of pinpricks leaking blood. Everyone on the set could see that I had dozens of tiny wounds. Of course I dropped the bottle of champagne on my foot as well. After that, she was understandably panicked whenever she had to do any filming with Sellers.
Join the Casino Royale fun movement!
You know, I love Peter Sellers. He was extremely talented and did some really funny and great roles. But he seemed like he was an absolute nightmare to work with. I guess he was somehow unbalanced in some way. His behavior might have been worth putting up with for certain films and roles, but here it doesn't look like the trade-off was anywhere near worth the aggravation. I mean, he's being paid an astronomical fee, but he doesn't want to be funny. He barely shows up to the set, and when he does, he just creates tension and drama. He doesn't get along with his co-stars, or director, or the producer. Why even bother hiring him? It's like bringing a rocking chair to the beach. What's the point? Orson Welles wasn't in the best of health, mostly due to his weight. He could perform only one short take under the hot studio lights, after which he had to shower and change. Casino Royale managed to garner some honors. Burt Bacharach's song, The Look of Love, written for the movie, was nominated for an Oscar. Feldman had tried to cut it from the film because it wasn't funny. I never heard anything about Niven and Andress during all this. I guess they just kept their heads down and tried to get through this craziness as best they could. I wonder what the problems were with the catering service. How else can you end this movie but with a huge barroom or casino brawl with cowboys and Indians, bubbles and fireworks? Look, there are some seals, a monkey, George Raft, William Holden, gold girls, before the casino blows up and everyone dies. The end. What a knee slapper, huh? Oh yeah, did I mention Feldman suffered a heart attack during production? He blamed it on Sellers. This is not a good movie. Although, there are some positives I always found in this crazy film. You can see all that money from the huge budget spent on some of these sets. The East German school, the massive casino, all those far-out rooms that Niven is running down, and the hideout of Smersh. A lot of it looks pretty impressive, but it doesn't amount to anything. It's great that they have all these over-the-top expensive sets to have the actors stand in, but if they're not doing anything interesting or funny, they're all pointless. It's weird, when I watch this film now, after all those Austin Power movies, those films seem to be inspired by Casino Royale as much as the real James Bond flicks. Maybe even more so. The music is all pretty catchy. Burt Bacharach, Herb Alpert, and the Tijuana Brass, they're all good tunes. It's the one thing from this film that I consistently go back to. It's a great time capsule of the period with all that stuff. Those acid-induced series of colorful frolics with psychedelic images and kicky music. Can you dig it? And the women. Wow. There are plenty of gorgeous 60s chicks showing up throughout the film. They have the groovy dresses, the hairstyles, the makeup. I certainly don't mind looking at them. They look great. Other than that, the film is a mess and is never as funny as it thinks it is, despite how hard it's trying. Bond fans might find it amusing seeing a few Bond actors from Bond films pop up, but for me, I find it more fascinating to see Bond alumni show up in the cheaper Bond knockoffs during this period. With the budget this film had, I'm surprised they couldn't shanghai more cameos from Bond villains and girls into it. The stories behind Casino Royale is what makes it such a fascinating film for me. The filming of Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now might have been nuts, but I think Casino Royale really rivals it as one of the most tumultuous movie productions ever. At least Apocalypse resulted in a good film. All this chaos might have seemed worth it if it created a great or even good movie, but it didn't. All the troubles that were going on behind the scenes really show in the film. At least when watching it, you start wondering, what's going on with this movie? I think the only thing that was kind of smart was them just giving up trying to tell a coherent story, just surrendering to the riot that this film was being made in and accepting that it will just be a strange psychedelic movie. Let's do it that way. That would seem easier to pull off than trying to make it a straightforward narrative film out of this confusion. But it makes the biggest cardinal sin for comedy with me. It's just not funny. Feldman might have been a great, likable talent agent and a good publicist in his day, but as a film producer, at least for Casino Royale, he was a disaster. It seemed like he simply followed the kitchen sink philosophy. Even when problems arose, his solutions were more and bigger. More directors, more writers, more actors, bigger sets, bigger budget. All of that resulted in was just more and bigger troubles. Plus, it didn't help the film be any better. That's the thing that always irritated me. Probably the best Fleming Bond novel. I can't help but think what could have been. What could have happened if EON Films held the rights to Casino Royale and adapted it during the Bond series' early years? It might have been one of the greatest Bond films ever. Instead, it was made into this. I'm sure Broccoli and Saltzman could have done better. In the end, Casino Royale did make money. It ended up being the 13th highest grossing movie in 1967. 5 slots behind You Only Live Twice. I suspect the business it did was more attributed to the James Bond name rather than the actual film itself, though. Casino Royale was the final film Feldman produced. He died in 1968. The 60s spy craze started to die down. The Bond knockoffs and imitators gradually started to disappear. The real Bond films would continue to be popular, but the copycat spy films that grew out of the Bond craze soon became a short-term fad, and most were forgotten. Now looking at Casino Royale today, it's become a curiosity, an example of a film production out of control, with just a Bond title that really isn't that good. Although it does have a lot of hot chicks in it. And I'm serious, someone should really get a docudrama made about the making of this flick. I think it could be great. In 1999, after decades of Casino Royale being that elusive title for Bond producers, it finally made its way into their hands. This would set the stage for 2006's official adaptation of Casino Royale. Whoa, wait a minute. Just because the movie was finished and premiered, the madness didn't stop. On May 6, 1967, the Saxe Savoy Theater in Boston, Massachusetts, had a Casino Royale movie promotion, where anyone dressed in a James Bond spy type of trench coat would be admitted free to see the film at a 4 a.m. screening. About 10,000 college-age youth showed up, and all hell broke loose. The theater obviously couldn't fit them all in, so the thousands that were refused admission decided to tear apart the street, break a lot of windows, and since they had nothing better to do in those early morning hours, to get in some looting. While the police tried to control our dejected Bond fans outside, inside the theater wasn't much calmer. The crowd was so worked up, they weren't in much of a mood to watch a movie, I guess. The projectionist kept the movie running, despite the chaotic behavior of the audience. There was fighting in the aisles, a couple of seats caught fire, and a broken fire hose that was flailing out of control, soaking the audience. Afterwards, when the smoke cleared, the general manager of SAC Theaters was quoted as saying, "Under no condition will there be another preview of this type by any SAC theater. I never dreamed that this situation would have resulted." That's kind of a fitting end to the story of Casino Royale, don't you think?
Join the Casino Royale fun movement.